Good afternoon and welcome everyone to this meeting of the Randwick Local Planning Panel, the time being 1 o'clock. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the various lands we occupy for this meeting, the Aboriginal people, their spirits and ancestors. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. The meeting today is to consider the determination of one development application and to provide advice to Council on a planning proposal. The panel members for these matters are myself, Lindsay Fletcher, as the Independent Chair, Deborah Laidlaw and Jason Perica as the Independent Expert members, and the Community member, Michelle Finnegan. This meeting is being held by public video conference due to the COVID-19 precautions. As the panel chair, I'm requesting that you be considerate and respectful of each other and remain on mute until I ask you to speak at the meeting. I also request that none of you interject while another person is speaking. Otherwise, I will have to request that you no longer be part of the meeting. The panel operates in terms of a code of conduct and operating guidelines, which have been modified to facilitate effective functioning of the panel during the COVID restrictions. The temporary changes are available to view on Council's website. This public meeting will be recorded and will be placed on the Council's website following the meeting. If that is of concern to you on privacy grounds, then I suggest you take it into consideration in your decision to make a public statement before the panel today. In terms of the code, general declarations of interest have been provided before the meeting by all panel members, as well as a specific declaration of interest in relation to the matters being considered today. Can I ask the individual members to just confirm and place on the record that they have any conflicts of interest and that they've completed the declaration? Jason?
Conflicts of interest from Jason Perica.
Deborah Laidlaw, I have no conflicts of interest and have submitted a declaration.
Michelle Finnegan,
Michelle?
I've got no conflicts of interest and have submitted a declaration.
Thank you all. The signed declarations will also be available to view through the Council's website by tomorrow afternoon. I also wish to advise that all members of the public addressing the panel today must declare, prior to commencing their address, any political contributions or donations exceeding $1,000 made over the past 2 years to any political party or candidate who contested the last ordinary election of Council. Our usual practice is to allow each speaker 3 minutes to present, including speakers representing community groups, individuals, and the applicant. If you have registered to speak, your address to the panel will be recorded. You'll be given a sound warning 30 seconds before your time limit, and I do have a limited discretion to allow extra time if appropriate. We will hear first from councillors, followed by members of the public, and then from the applicant on the development application matter. The panel has been provided with a copy of all the submissions received in response to the public exhibition. Therefore, there is no need for speakers to repeat the points made in those submissions. I ask that each speaker be heard in silence while they are addressing the panel, and that courtesy and respect be observed throughout this meeting. There is to be no personal criticism directed at any speaker or council staff. Any such criticism would be contrary to the panel's code of conduct and will not be accepted. Panel members will ask questions of the speakers to clarify our understanding of what is being said, or may ask questions, I should say. After hearing from all speakers, the panel will adjourn to debate the matters and make its determinations. If more information is required by the panel, the decision may be deferred, either for a further public meeting or to be dealt with electronically. The panel decisions and recording will be made available on the Council's website as soon as possible, usually the following day. There is to be no recording of this meeting other than the official recording. The panel will now consider the first item, which is the planning proposal for numbers 1 and 3 Berwick Street in Coogee. This is a matter where the role of the panel is to provide advice to the Council. It is the Council at a future meeting that will determine the proposal. We have 5 people registered to address the panel on this item, 2 councillors, 2 speakers for the recommendation and 1 against. So I'll now invite our first speaker, Councillor Kathy Nielsen, to address the panel.
Thank you, Chair. I strongly support this report recommending the inclusion of 1 and 3 Berwick Street, Coogee as heritage items of the Randwick LEP 2012, and I draw your attention to the statement on page 16 of the business paper, but page 2 of the City Plan report by Karamay Danas, Director of City Heritage. The interwall bungalows with intact architectural characteristics of the style are now unusual and seldom found in the area and are now rare items in Coogee. This is referring to number 3, which supports the local heritage significance, but it also reinforces the stronger contribution 1, 3 and 5 make as a group heritage item. I agree that the proposed new heritage items will have positive social effects for the local community through the retention and conservation of buildings with historical value and which represent the historical development of the area. And I welcome any additional points that the panel can provide in support of a proposed planning proposal. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Do any panel members have any questions of Councillor Nielsen?
No, not from me.
Nor me.
Thank you.
I'm seeing those. Thank you. So our next speaker is Councillor Michael Olive. Michael.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, 1, 3 and 5 Berwick Street are 3 interwall buildings that form a very pretty corner at the intersection where Berwick Street meets Carr Street and Mount Street, and it marks that sweep of the old tram line that goes down Havelock Avenue, and it creates a period feel which sort of is quite prominent and quite noticeable to locals and visitors alike. And I feel that to modernise any of those buildings in that interwall cluster would detract from any of the others and would detract from the cluster and be a detriment to the local story of Coogee and the local heritage. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor. Again, panel members, any questions?
No.
Okay, thank you. The next speaker that I have listed is Mr. Patrick Cunningham. Mr. Cunningham, are you there? And let me remind you that you need to declare whether you've made any political donations before you speak.
Good afternoon, Chair. I can declare that I was a Labor candidate in the local council elections. I don't think I've got anywhere near the $1,000 limit for contributions. It was more like $50.
That's fine.
$50.
Thank you.
If I may,
thank you. So,
if I may first correct a slight but insignificant error in the report. The council report at page 52 attributes the architect for our property, number 1 Berwick Street, being Clement Thomas Clancy Jr. or Clement Clancy Jr., son of Clement Clancy Sr., preeminent architect of the Catholic Romanesque in New South Wales. The architect is in fact the father. It would be a tall ask for Clement Jr. to be the architect when the plans were submitted to Randwick Council in September 1925, and Clement Clancy Jr. was born in October 1926, the year 1 Berwick Street was built. Clement Clancy Sr. was born in 1891 and died in 1961, lived with his wife Mary and their 3 children, Molly, Clement and John, over in Cabramatta, and he was there for his whole life. The son Clement, born 1926, lived with his parents. He married in 1964 Cynthia O'Connor, and they lived in Black Street, Vaucluse. And Clement Jr. took over the business after his father died in 1963. Was when he was named the owner of the business, and he passed away in 2008. As to Clement Clancy Sr., in a publication by John East entitled The History of Romanesque-Inspired Architecture in Australia, that author notes that, quote, the preeminent architect of Catholic Romanesque in New South Wales was Clement Clancy, whose firm was responsible for around 20 Romanesque churches and chapels between 1927 and 1942. And I think that's significant because ours was built in 1926 and therefore may be one of the last domestic commissions that Clement Clancy undertook. Some of the churches are well known, and the Mater Dei Orphanage at Camden, 1927, St Francis Xavier Catholic Church, Arncliffe, 1931, St Christopher's Cathedral in Canberra, 1938, Holy Family Church in Maroubra, 1939, the Romanesque extension in 1940 to Our Lady Star of the Sea at Watson's Bay, and St Patrick's Cathedral in Parramatta. They're some of the ones that he's well known for, or his firm certainly. Clancy, it's quoted that Clancy embraced this style and made it his own, and in the process established himself in a position of dominance in New South Wales, such as Fritsch had enjoyed in Victoria. High quality brickwork, wheel windows and arched corbel tables are all typical of Clancy's buildings, many of which were apparently designed by his talented assistant, Rosette Edmonds. Now that's another interesting point to do with our property, because Rosette Edmonds was one of the first female architects in New South Wales. The course was established in 1918 at the University of Sydney, and she was one of the first of the cohorts of women to go through. In 1923, there were only 6 female architects.
So, Mr. Cunningham, we do have a time limit, so I'm just wondering whether. No, that's fine. I'm wondering whether I could ask you to sum up fairly quickly. But I take it you represent, I think, the owner of number 1. I take it you support the recommendation.
I certainly do. But I just two things that Clancy's well known in this area for. He was also the architect for St Michael's Golf Course, and was also instrumental in actually getting its purchase, having met the owner and doing a handshake deal. And he was one of the founding members of St Michael's. He was also involved with the Brown Nurses up on Dudley Street, and in 1940 was constructed their major building around the cottage, which was opened by the Archbishop at the time. Rosette, I'll just go back to Rosette. She was renowned as the lead designer for Clancy, and we've kept the original plans and hand-painted plans for the building, and we believe, according to the history written, a PhD history written about women architects, it's to be attributed to her in terms of the plans that were drawn up by Clancy's by company.
Yeah. Thank you. Can I ask panel members whether they have any questions of Mr. Cunningham?
Not for me, thanks.
I think I'm getting no's all around. So thank you, Mr. Cunningham. We will take on board what you've said, and clearly what you've said is in support of the recommendation that's before us.
Can I just check, my apologies, can I just check if any of those slides came up on the shared screen?
No, but we were circulated with the PowerPoint presentation.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the answer is no, they didn't come up on the shared screen, but we have each received a copy and had the opportunity to review that PowerPoint presentation. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
The next speaker is Mr. Ryan Elliott. I received a request for two, and the normal practice is 1 speaker for and 1 against, but I'd received a request for an additional speaker in favour of the recommendation. Given we have only 2 items, I agreed to that request. So, Mr. Elliott, could I ask you again and remind you, if appropriate, to declare whether or not you might have made a political donation to a councillor at the last election?
No political donations. Chair.
Thank you. Please proceed.
Yeah, so thank you for the opportunity to speak. The neighbours in 1, which is Patrick, you just heard from, 5 Berwick and 7 Berwick, as well as the neighbours at 109 Mount Street, where I live, and 101 Mount Street, supportive of heritage listing of 1 and 3 Berwick Street. We'd previously sought an interim heritage protection order for 3 Berwick Street, which we viewed as at risk, and this was proven to be founded when the tenant was served notice to vacate, and the developer owner of number 3 sought to demolish the building via a compliant development certificate. This was received by the neighbour on the 13th of October, postmarked the 11th of October, but the letter itself post-dated 29th of September, some 12 days earlier, so 48 hours trying to deal with that. In March 2019, 3.5 years ago, the owner of number 1 Berwick Street emailed council and asked for the heritage consideration for numbers 1, 3 and 5. In June 2020, council instructed Extent Heritage to review the properties in Randwick as a whole. As a result of COVID, this was largely conducted on a desktop-only basis. Number 1 Berwick Street, for example, was captured incorrectly as a 3-storey flat building. It's a single title, 1-owner duplex. And number 3 states the veranda has been enclosed versus we've been advised the glass is original Venetian glass. And it was purpose-built as a dentist surgery and residence and not modified. In July of 2020, a different developer to the current owner submitted a DA to demolish both 3 and 5, and an interim heritage order was granted in December 2020 on number 5 to allow for its heritage reviewed. By March 21, Extent confirmed heritage at 5 Berwick Street, and that was exhibited by council in May 21. In May 2021, the council also agreed to set aside number 1 and number 3 Berwick Street for a future in-depth heritage review. That was due to the desktop analysis as a result of COVID. And you'd be aware, most recently, City Plan Heritage have now completed that in-depth review for number 1 and number 3, recommending heritage. For number 3 particularly, it has heritage on 5 of the criterion, A, B, C, F and G. Council obviously exhibited in the LEP number 5. The developer subsequently sold number 3 and number 5 Berwick Street independently of each other, selling number 3 to another developer who now seeks to demolish its 1920s property with a new DA lodged in September 2022. Berwick Street is at risk of being demolished, and we'll lose that building if heritage isn't passed. I don't really want to focus on the proposed 2 semi-detached dwellings at 4 stories, but presenting as colour-bond shipping containers. They would break up that symphony between numbers 1, 3 and 5, whereas at present that streetscape remains uninterrupted. The heritage report provided on the DA by the developer, the most recent DA, consists of just 3 exterior pictures of number 5 and only 4 exterior pictures of number 3. There's no interior pictures provided, which is a shame because the interiors are largely intact, original. There's ornate ceilings, there's picture rails, there's original doors and hardware. The DA heritage report by the developer states that it's based on the previous report prepared by Urbis, who are acting on behalf of the previous developer, and it's been used as a reference point. And it's worth remembering that the prior report that the previous developer provided found no heritage whatsoever at 3 and 5, versus, in fact, the heritage has been established for number 5. And it repeats inaccuracies such as saying Sarah Dixon sold the property in 1924 to Victor Pugliese, versus Victor Pugliese purpose building that dentist on vacant land that they'd acquired from Sarah Dixon. The entire conclusion of the report reads, the proposal will have a minimum acceptable impact on the heritage significance of number 3 Berwick Street, which I think really undersells the impact that those 4-storey colour-bond buildings will have on both 1 and 5 Berwick Street. Number 3 Berwick Street itself is rare and interesting, constructed in 1924 for what we understand to be Coodie's first dentist surgery, operating for 95 years uninterrupted until the developer acquired it. It presents as a trilogy of 3 1920s buildings, 1, 3 and 5 Berwick Street, located diagonally across the road from the heritage listed Federation Doctors Surgery. The streetscape of sandstone wall, which the DA seeks to demolish entirely, is enjoyed by many, and the trio stand at what's considered the gateway to Coogee Village as buses pass down Carr Street into Hadlock Avenue, the old tram line, and down to the beach, stopping outside these fine examples of 1920s heritage homes. One of the residents at 7 Berwick Street was able to fill a petition with a few hundred signatures seeking the heritage listing of number 3 Berwick Street in fairly short order. Joe Public were very enthusiastic in saving the building, and most viewed the heritage aspect as absolutely self-evident on looking at the building. I think also I've noted that Pugliese, the original owner, was a member of an interesting family running 3 theatres and a chain of shoe shops. 3 Berwick Street was originally named Roma in memory of his family in Italy. Respectfully, the neighbours are all seeking heritage listing of 1 and 3 Berwick Street. The owner of number 1 Berwick Street, Patrick, has followed the process from 2019 for both 1 and 3 Berwick Street, and we're hopeful the panel sees fit to approve the council's recommendation in heritage listing number 1 and number 3 Berwick Street. I'd be happy to
thank you, Mr. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Elliott. Do panel members have any questions?
No.
I'm getting no, so thank you for that. We'll now move to Mr. Tone Wheeler. Mr. Wheeler is speaking against the recommendation.
Thank you very much, Chair. I have no political affiliations or donations to Randwick Council at any time.
Thank you.
I think there are 2 principal issues at stake here, one of which is process and the other one is the fabric. The building that we're talking about is in an area that is zoned R3, multi-dwelling, and it's been confirmed as such in the draft LEP referred to in the Statement of Environmental Effect that was submitted along with our DA. And at that time, there was no indication that 3 and 1 were being listed for heritage. And so we proceed on the basis of what the information is that we are provided by Council in its existing documents and even in its draft documents. And at that stage, there's no intention. So we follow what Council are suggesting for the area, that it's R3, that it's medium density, that it increased the number of houses in the area, the number of occupants. And my clients, having purchased a property, made a submission on that basis. We knew that there was a report from Urbis, very, very well-regarded heritage architects, probably the most well-known heritage architect of the Land Environment Court, and that found no heritage value in it. And I must say, as an architect of 50 years standing, I would concur with that these are plentiful buildings, certainly at the time, but they're essentially constructed out of things which are made from the hammer barn of its time. Although the plaster work and cornices and so on seem fancy to us, they're nothing more than a stock standard item that comes out of a hardware store. So there's nothing really special about this building other than perhaps it was a dental surgery back in the day and then we carried on. Of course, that wouldn't be permissible in the site because there's no continuing use rights. And so the building itself, when we inspected it and when we had a look at it, we agreed that there was very little value to it, particularly since it's out of scale. Number 5 and number 3 are out of scale to what else is in Berwick Street. So we made a proposal for a building of 4 levels. No point is it 4 stories, Mr. Elliott. It's 3 stories over 4 levels. Anyway, it's clear that the local community would rather have no change whatsoever. You know, there are, as we know in Randwick, as most suburbs in Sydney, plenty of NIMBYs and notes. Notes, by the way, for you, is not over there either. And so there's quite a number of people who've objected to this who are not materially affected by it. But one of the things that I would note is that in the fabric of the building, of the existing building, it covers almost the entire site to the back fence. And if you look at the photographs of the back garden area, garden, I say, it's not a garden, it is a very small pathway. There's very, very poor amenity given from that building. So while the front of it might have an attraction to the passing parade of people, the building's actually not a very good building on the upper level. And if you were to keep the front of it, then it's a building that can't actually be redeveloped successfully because it's so cramped at the back on such a small block of land. I understand that council's moving to the heritage order. There's an interim heritage order, which, as council will know, we've appealed that interim heritage order through the Land and Environment Court through a statement of deed that's been lodged, and that we look to press that matter when we can. And I think that the issue of the fabric of the building is way overstated in the City Plan Services report, considering that they don't even mention the reports, the other reports that have been made, and give due weight to what was said by Graham Hall and by Urbis. And so, as you know, heritage consultants are not a registered business like an engineer or an architect to be registered. So it's a matter of opinion. It's a matter of appeal to the ICAMUS Charter, which hasn't been made here. And so we would say that that building is not a sufficient merit to warrant it being kept as a heritage item, that it would be better if there's infill. We agree that the infill that was offered in the first DA by other architects other than ourselves was unsympathetic. We think that there are more sympathetic ways in which you could develop it. But I think the heritage order that's being placed on it places far too much value on what is really a kind of run-of-the-mill interior of the 1920s. And that should that have to be retained, as it is in the heritage order at the moment, the draft heritage order, that house is likely to exist in facade only and not be a worthwhile dwelling for someone to live in. That's the entirety of my submission. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Wheeler. One question from me, perhaps to start, and that is, you've obviously commented, understandably, on number 3. Do you have any comment to make on the proposed listing of number 1, firstly? And secondly, do you have any comment to make on the significance of the grouping of the 3 properties, 5, 3 and 1?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That is a very, that's definitely a lacuna in my presentation. Yes, I would support entirely the listing of number 1 because I think it is of a scale and size that is unusual. And the presentation of the building as a Romanesque building, it's hardly in keeping with the climate and nature of Coogee to have such a dark black building, more urban rather than beachside perhaps. But its scale and size and its unusual nature and medium density quality to it, I think it does deserve to have a listing. And I think the point is that it actually is of a scale that is commensurate with what is in the surrounding areas. I think 3 and 5 are remnants of another time of a different scale, and we would disagree with the listing. Number 5 has already been listed, so there's pointless in me commenting on that. Having done that, it calls into question whether you would actually see them as a grouping. I don't. I think number 1 on the corner stands as a very solid, proud, very contingent part of architecture in that corner. I think the next 2 houses are, similar to the kind of Lake Federation, Californian bungalow style that can be found all over Sydney. And I think it's out of scale in that area. Should be removed.
Thank you. Panel members, do you have any questions of Mr. Wheeler?
No.
Is that no? It sounds like it's no all around. And panel members, any questions? Do you have any questions of council officers in relation to this item at this time? We did have the benefit of a briefing prior to our meeting from the council officers. So. And I think no. All right. Well, thank you for that. Thank you to all our speakers. We will take that on board. And as I indicated earlier, we have another item to deal with, but we will then close the meeting and move to a separate meeting to deliberate on both items. And our results of that will be published on the council website in due course. So the next item on our agenda is the development application for 88 Frenchman's Road in Randwick. And we have two people registered to address the panel on this matter. Mr. Bill Tulloch on behalf of objectors, and Mr. Nathan Forsyth, who I understand is the architect, on behalf of the applicant. So can I invite Mr. Bill Tulloch to address the panel? And again, remind you, if you've made donations, to please declare that.
Thank you, Chair. No donations. It's best not to encourage them, I always think, Chair. Yes, I am representing Esther Sakadi Clark, the next door neighbour to this DA. And I have submitted a very brief 2-page submission that I'm sure you have, dated 17th of November. So I won't go into great detail. All what I want to say is really in those 2 pages. The main concern here, obviously, for Esther, is that this proposed development will blank solar access to her home completely. She'll have none left. At the moment, her living rooms, as you can see within the assessment report, face west. They do not face any other orientation, and she relies upon that western afternoon sun to give us some solar access into her house. Unfortunately, with the proposed development, it basically will blank all of that solar access to all the western faced rooms, but including the main living spaces. And therefore, it presents, to my mind, an unreasonable outcome. When you look at the LEP principles, obviously what the applicant is saying is a reasonably compliant development. But when you look at the LEP objectives, clearly it states there needs to be a reasonable level of solar access. There needs to be adequate ambient daylight. And those words, reasonable and adequate, as we all know, means fair and sensible and moderate and satisfactory or acceptable in quality. It's a high bar, really, to achieve. And just to simply say that there is a compliant envelope here doesn't basically suggest to me that the applicant here has properly considered the situation. I'll continue. Okay, someone's clicked themselves off. That's good. What I suggest is that really there is excessive ceiling heights, both at ground and first floor, that could be reduced. If those ceiling heights were reduced to 2.7 and 2.4, and a parapet detail was taken off in lieu of a normal pitched roof detail over those heights, there would be more available solar access into this house throughout the year. Obviously, it would still not give you solar access in midwinter, but it would definitely give you more solar access throughout the year. It just does, to me, seems unreasonable to actually blank someone's solar access when there is an alternative, more skillful approach by putting more moderate ceiling heights and more appropriate pitched roof on top to reduce that outcome. Within the submission, I close with several bullet points that I suggest could form a part of a condition of consent. It would really achieve a fairly certain outcome in this respect. And I leave you with the suggestion that really, with minimum building separation on this particular development, I really feel there should be a reasonable sectional profile to ensure reasonable solar access is maintained in this respect, to at least give the neighbours some access to solar access throughout the year rather than none. So hopefully that's clear. Chair, thank you very much for allowing me to speak here today.
Thank you, Mr. Tulloch. Can I actually invite you to very quickly go through those dot points in the end of your submission? The reason I do that is the submission, whilst it's available to us and we've had the opportunity to read it, the next speaker for the applicant, of course, hasn't seen it. So I think it's appropriate that you very quickly outline those points.
Certainly, Chair. The first bullet point really is to maintain the ground floor at what is proposed throughout the entire ground floor plate. The building steps up towards the rear obviously that pop-up at the back is obviously going to cause solar access drama. We contend that that ground floor could just continue all the way through the whole floor plate. So the basis of what I'm now going to say is really gives the applicant exactly the gross floor area that he wants. It simply then lowers the sectional profile. So the next thing is really dropping the ground ceiling height from 3 meters to 2.7. The next one is obviously reducing the first floor by the required amount to give it a 3.1 meter floor to floor zone. The next one is to reduce the first floor ceiling from 2.7 to 2.4. And then the next one is really deleting the parapet detail, reverting to a normal pitched roof format with a low pitched roof, minimalizing the eaves to 300. And then, as I said before, no step design, perhaps reduce the levels in the rear garden area to make that whole ground floor flow out to the rear garden. That really is the main essence of it. The only other concern that the neighbour has is the first floor windows. Because they're so close together and some of these windows could be openable, they really would prefer to sill heights to be 1.6 metres above the finished floor level in the side setback zones, because they're so close and because some of those windows could be openable. Hopefully that just explains it, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Teller. Panel members, any questions of Mr. Teller?
I had one on your second suggestion to reduce the ground floor ceiling height to 2.7. Where the new extension meshes into the existing building, which appears to have a 3 meter ceiling height, how do you see that could be resolved, that you would come out of the existing building and then the ceiling height would have to step down?
Into a lower ceiling zone, but at least the 2.7 carries through to that new part of the new extension. It could be achieved. It just is a drop in a bulkhead from the 3 meter ceiling zone to the 2.7.
So I think the lounge room at the front and bedroom 1 must be in the, yes, is in the original building. So you would see that you would come through that hallway and then there would just be a bulkhead there, and then you'd be walking into the new extension with the 2.7 meter ceiling height.
That's correct.
And there would be no structural issue or concern about doing that.
No, I mean, obviously that the back half of the building is a new built form, so that could easily be handled as you transfer from the high to the low. Okay.
And the second issue, I just would wonder if you could comment that there's a 400 millimeter structural zone, which I don't think you've taken issue with. Well, that might be a better question to ask the architect, but is that something that you see could be reduced, or?
It could be marginally reduced. Normally, obviously, as you most probably be aware, a 3.1 meter story height from floor to floor is reasonably the normal story height that is considered acceptable to get the 2.7 ceiling with a structure. Obviously, you've got finishes, you've got ceiling finishes and floor finishes. It could be tightened up a touch, and that would be beneficial as well. I've left it at the 400 zone to be reasonable in this instance, to understand that obviously there is finishes and to be added, as well as obviously tolerances and deflection zones. So if we could achieve the things that I've stated, my sort of issue is that if we could get the first floor ceiling down to that 80.8 level, that would hopefully get the neighbours some access to more solar access in over time. So basically that should easily give them a 2.7 and a 2.4 at the upper level for the bedrooms. And I think that is a reasonable outcome for the applicant here in terms of for the ceiling zones, and while still obviously reducing the amount of solar access for the neighbours, at least it gives them some chance of getting some solar access throughout the year.
Sorry, just also following up from that first question about what it means to drop the ceiling height down to 2.7 behind the existing cottage. You have got bedroom 2 above, which appears to sit on the structure of the existing buildings. So how would you see that? How would you see that being handled?
Well, again, it would need to be considered in that sectional profile whether obviously the ceiling stays in the front part. The front part of the property obviously would need to maintain at least a 2.7 sort of height zone. But I think when you look at the side elevation, there is more than enough scope to ensure really the 3 metre and then the 2.7 can occur, and the 2.4 could then, ceiling height could really roll all the way across that zone above the 3. So there's opportunity there. It needs to obviously careful consideration by the architect, but I'm sure there's a better solution there to minimise this loss. But that's in general terms, obviously. I think this sort of reduction would greatly assist. The 3 metre height ceiling in the cottage could stay. There would need to be obviously a reduction in height, and then drop the required bulk down as best one can within that restraint.
Okay.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Panel members, any further questions from panel members? Michelle, no. Jason, no. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Tulloch.
Thank you.
We'll now hear from Mr. Nathan Forsyth, who I understand is the architect for the applicant, representing the applicant. Sorry, Nathan, you might be on mute. I can't hear you.
Just check your volume in the bottom right. Sometimes you mightn't be on mute in the Teams meeting, but your computer volume might be off. Sometimes that happens.
Thanks, Jason. Angela, I'm not sure whether it might be possible for Mr. Forsyth to ring in so that we can hear from him.
Is that better?
Yeah.
That's better. That's working. Okay. Excellent.
Okay, no dramas. Thank you very much for the opportunity to address the panel today, confirming that I have made no political contribution to donations. Mr. Chairman, just a correction to my introduction. I'm not the architect. I'm actually the applicant. And so,
sorry.
No dramas at all. As set out in my submission, my wife and I moved here in 2014, and we sought to make a home for our growing family. We've absolutely loved being part of the local community, and we now have 3 growing children, and what we're trying to achieve here is to provide adequate space for our family in a home that we absolutely love. I think it's important to note that when we did engage our architects, our brief to them was to design a home that we would love, that was completely compliant with the relevant conditions, but was also sympathetic to the needs of our immediate neighbours. And we believe that to the extent that was practical, given the development, that was achieved. I would like to make one correction to the assertion that Mr. Tulloch makes in regarding the fact that the solar access isn't entirely lost. That is not true in this instance, and that has been evidenced in the report by the Randwick Town Planner. I do accept that there will be some loss of solar access, and the reality is that that's unavoidable given the configuration of the houses. For us, this was about creating a space whereby our kids could grow up, our families could come and visit. And one of the things that we didn't like about our current house is the low ceiling heights in the back of the house. And so whilst I haven't had the benefit of receiving the suggested amendments prior to this meeting, the suggestion that they are both lowered is not particularly appealing in this instance, and rather the conditions that were suggested by the Randwick City planner, whereby specifically item 2 relating to the reduction of 300 millimetres for the rear portion, we believe that is whilst again not ideal for us, we believe that is not an unreasonable concession to ask upon us, and we would be happy to abide by that. I don't have any other comments to make other than, notwithstanding the number of submissions in relation to this development, we do not believe that this is a contentious development in any aspect. There has been a very large number of precedents set both on this street and in the local surrounding area. The zoning was an attraction when we bought the area, that we would always have the opportunity to build up and provide a home for our family to grow and to live in. So I don't have anything other to add than that, but thank you for your time and consideration.
Thank you. And again, my apologies. I understood you were the architect. So,
no, that's no dramas.
Panel members, any questions of Mr. Forsyth at this stage?
I appreciate that you're not the architect, but in terms of the suggestions to drop the rear of the building down, because you've got to step up at the moment going up towards that section at the rear garden. Would you just like to comment on how amenable you would be to that particular amendment?
Yeah, as you correctly point out, I'm not the architect, and so the practicalities of that and the expense associated with that I can't comment on. But in concept, as set out and suggested in item 2, we're not adverse to lowering it by 300 mils. Anything more than that starts to impose on the space in which we would like to live in. So completely open to the suggested modification. Beyond that, I would need to discuss the practicality and implications of that with the architects.
Okay, Jason or Michelle, any questions?
I've got a couple. I guess I should probably preface the questions with an observation, just to give some context to the questions, I guess. But I mean, it is a semi-detached building. It's largely compliant, as in the council's assessment report. You do have adjoining semis, and by their nature, they tend to be close and often solely oriented on their long axis to a side boundary.
Yep.
You've got a fairly large proposal of 5 bedrooms for the majority of the footprint of the building, and it does present as quite a large building for a semi. So I'm not surprised the neighbour would raise concerns.
Yep.
As you know, you could appreciate a few of them, I think. And I think the proposition that while compliance is largely achieved, the notion of trying to make amendments that try to find a reasonable balance between amenity impacts, and particularly overshadowing and amenity for different rooms and a site response, is, I think, a reasonable position to take. And probably the elements that I looked at that I questioned, the first wasn't so much related, I think, because of its scale, and in a way that's also in part due to a central stair and void area which provides some amenity, again because of limitations often in semi-detached building. It does have the effect of pushing up the bulk longwise. It is close to the apex of the building. That front balcony, it was a bit lacking in terms of detailing of how the front balcony was to be resolved with the existing roof form. And I know it's not a heritage item nor in a conservation area, but I wondered about the detailing of that and the importance of that to the design, because it seemed like a more sympathetic visual addition might be not to have that balcony at the front. Is there anything you'd say to that?
Look, again, they're not being the architect, difficult to comment on that, but in principle, that was what was suggested. We thought it would make sense in the context of it.
There's not much outlook elsewhere, but yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and there, it is not intended to be a balcony that is people are going out and using. It's purely an opening for light and air.
Yeah. And the next sort of couple of questions are about the windows. So on the side windows, I think partly because of its length and its size and the nature of the windows it made, well, you know, that are proposed to be louvers and conditions about obscure glazing. There is a bit of a practical issue, I think, about the recommended conditions to, you know, potentially fix those. You know, you can't really close them off because you need to have ventilation in bedrooms. But it's trying to find a way of protecting privacy. It seemed to me like an option might be to have fixed obscure glazing to the approximate eye height of 1.6, but a louvers above that, as opposed to the option that's being put forward in the council staff report, because that might allow you to look up the sky but not down to the neighbours. What would you say about that? I know your architect's not here, but you're directing your architect and it's your house. What would you say about that?
Yeah, for us, we've got no desire to look in on our neighbour's place either, so that's certainly not in our interest. Any design feature proposal that maintained our access to light and air, which met that criteria, we're completely open to. That was what was proposed, and that's what we thought made sense, looks good. We certainly don't see it as a privacy issue. I think the reality, if you see that wall, there's no way to look into that, given the configuration of the windows on the opposing side. There's no way to look in. So that was never a consideration or a discussion point for us. That was what was put forward. If there's some
modification of the form, you could understand the rest for it. And the other thing was the windows to that rear ensuite also face the side boundary, which seemed a little bit odd to me. I've seen the internal layout and understand probably why it's like that, but in a way it seemed like a little bit of a missed opportunity not to be looking over your rear yard. I mean, you've got that sort of landscape bed above your ground floor set back to the first floor and your own rear sort of yard and separation. I would have thought that, you know, having some outlook over your own internal space and setback rather than the side of a neighbouring property that might also have a one-storey addition over time might be a better outcome. But what was the rationale for having the window on that side as opposed to the rear?
Well, if the rear of that section of the house is actually a bathroom, and so with a walk-in wardrobe behind it, so having a window there would remove the ability to put in built-in wardrobes and whatnot, and would not provide any additional light to the bedroom itself.
Right. Okay. So it's just about furnishing and light.
Correct.
But I don't think, does it provide light to the bedroom? I thought it was just light to the ensuite. I might have seen that. Anyway.
Yes. The one at the back would be light to the ensuite, as you say.
Yeah. It was more that window as opposed to the other one for the bedroom. And then it also led to questioning of the rear form, because I guess the overshadowing becomes more sensitive deeper into the site, because that's where the private open space is next door, let alone the side windows, you know, which would take the staff's comment that it'll be hard to protect the solar access with any first floor addition. But it is a long addition, and it does become more sensitive towards the rear because of the adjoining open space. And I was just thinking about the form of that rear addition, and in a way, and given it's only an ensuite, that if there was a way of making that a skillion form that dropped down towards the rear, that might take a bit of bulk out of the roof form and reduce some of the overshadowing. What would you say to that? So what I'm saying is not having necessarily a uniform ceiling height for the first floor, but for the rear ensuite only, perhaps having a skillion that comes down to a lower point to the rear so that some of the rear upper bulk is taken out.
Again, can't really talk to the practicalities of that, but I can only imagine that has minimal impact on the solar for the other the house next door. I can't see that having a material impact on solar access, but would likely add additional costs.
Okay, they were my questions. Thanks.
Thank you. Panel members, anything arising from that? No further questions? No. All right. Well, thank you to all the speakers. We've now heard from all of the registered speakers, and I thank them all for their assistance. In accordance with the panel guidelines, the public meeting will now be closed, and the panel will move into a closed meeting to deliberate and vote on these items, and we have an additional electronic item. The outcome from voting and determination will be made available through the Council's website either late tonight or tomorrow. A recording of the public meeting will also be available through the Council's website. I thank Council's staff for their assistance so far with today's meeting, and I now declare the meeting closed, the time being 1:55 p.m. Thank you all. Panel members will sign on in a separate meeting. Thank you.